The boy who knew the truth. The courtroom like any other. The scent of polished wood and old paper filled the grand courtroom, a silent witness to countless family cases. Judge Rebecca Williams sat behind her imposing mahogany bench, her sharp eyes scanning the thick case file in front of her. At 42, she was known for her unwavering composure, her ability to separate emotion from law, and her relentless pursuit of justice for children who had no one else to fight for them. But today felt different. The case seemed routine. Another foster placement gone wrong. Another child shuffled from home to home like a misplaced file in a cluttered cabinet. But as she read the details, a strange unease settled in her chest. Elijah Marshall, 8 years old. 7 foster homes in 8 years. Why so many? Rebecca's eyes flickered over the paperwork, a frown deepening on her face. The records were incomplete. Unclear circumstances of entry into the foster system. A history of night terrors. Difficulty forming attachments. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temple. Something about this case wasn't right. Then her gaze shifted to the small boy sitting at the front of the courtroom. He was silent, unmoving, almost ghost-like. A navy sweater hung loosely on his frame, making him look smaller than he was. His dark eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands clenched tightly around something. A photograph, perhaps. Rebecca's stomach twisted. Why does this feel personal? A boy without a home. Your Honor, Patricia Turner's voice broke the silence, cool and detached, like a practiced politician. We've done everything we could, but Elijah is simply too difficult to handle. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. Too difficult to handle. Patricia smoothed her expensive skirt, her diamond bracelet catching the overhead lights. He refuses to speak. He won't participate in family activities, and when we try to engage him, he just stares. Her husband, James, nodded in agreement, adjusting his gold cufflinks. We have other foster children who are thriving in our home, but Elijah, he has had outbursts that concern us deeply. Rebecca drummed her fingers against her desk, keeping her voice calm. What kind of outbursts? Patricia hesitated, her lips tightening. He screams in his sleep. James sighed. Last week, we found him hiding in his closet at 3 a.m. He was clutching some old photograph. When we tried to help, he became hysterical. Rebecca's eyes flickered toward Elijah. The photograph. Whatever was in that picture meant something to him. The photograph that wouldn't let go. Elijah, Rebecca said softly, leaning forward. Would you like to tell me how you feel about all this? The boy didn't move. A social worker, Sarah Martins, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Your Honor, Elijah hasn't spoken in weeks. His therapist believes it's a response to past trauma. Rebecca scanned the file again. 7 foster homes, each termination citing failure to bond. No mention of his biological parents. No birth certificate. She glanced at the Turners. Their expensive clothes, their detached expressions, they had already given up on him. Mrs. Turner, Rebecca said, keeping her voice firm, you mentioned Elijah's refusal to bond. Have you considered that his withdrawal might be a cry for help rather than defiance? Patricia's perfect posture stiffened. Your Honor, with all due respect, we are experienced foster parents. We know the difference. James cleared his throat. We've given him everything. A private school, therapy, a room of his own. But he shows no appreciation. Rebecca's jaw clenched. They were measuring his worth in material things. Her gaze flickered back to Elijah. His small hands trembled slightly, still clutching the photograph. What was in that picture? The Turner's lawyer stepped forward. Your Honor, my clients request immediate termination of placement. Elijah is disruptive to their household, and they have other children to consider. Rebecca suppressed the sharp retort that threatened to rise in her throat. She turned to the social worker. Miss Martinez, what alternative placements are available for Elijah? Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Given his history, placement might be difficult. He would likely need to return to the group home temporarily. Elijah's grip on the photograph tightened. His shoulders tensed at the mention of the group home. Rebecca noticed. A moment that changed everything. She was about to make her ruling when it happened. Elijah stood up. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that Sarah instinctively reached out to steady him. The photograph slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. The courtroom went still. Then, in a small but clear voice, Elijah spoke. "You're my mom." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. The room erupted. Gasps filled the air. The Turners exchanged alarmed looks. Their lawyer sputtered something about emotional instability. But Elijah didn't look at them. He only looked at her. "You're my mom," he repeated, stronger this time. "I knew it when I saw you." Rebecca couldn't move. The photograph lay face down on the floor. The bailiff was speaking. The Turners were whispering furiously to their lawyer, but Rebecca couldn't hear any of it. Her heart pounded. Because in that moment, in the way Elijah looked at her, she felt it too. A connection she couldn't explain. A memory she couldn't reach. Somewhere in the depths of her past, a long-buried truth was trying to surface. The photograph holds the truth. "Court is in recess," Rebecca said quickly, barely recognizing her own voice. She stood, gathering her robes around her like armor. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." She turned, retreating to her chambers before anyone could stop her. She needed to be alone. Because something inside her had just shattered. Something about Elijah felt familiar. And she had no idea why. A secret that couldn't stay buried. Behind her closed office door, Rebecca reached for the small box she kept in her desk. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside was a hospital bracelet, a tiny knit cap, and a death certificate. Her hands shook. Because 8 years ago, she had lost a child. A stillborn. A baby she had never even held. A child that, according to official records, had never left the hospital. And yet, Elijah had called her Mom. And deep down, in the place where reason couldn't reach, she believed him. The photograph that changed everything. The weight of a memory. Judge Rebecca Williams sat in her dimly lit office, the heavy oak desk between her and the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The courthouse outside bustled with movement, lawyers making calls, clerks hurrying to and fro, cases being argued. But inside her chambers, everything was still. Her hands trembled as she held the small box in her lap. The box she hadn't touched in years. She slowly lifted the lid, revealing its contents: a hospital bracelet, a tiny blue knit cap, and a neatly folded piece of paper with the words "Certificate of Stillbirth" printed at the top. 8 years ago, she had signed this document. 8 years ago, she had been told her son was gone. But then, why had Elijah just called her Mom? Rebecca swallowed hard, willing herself to think logically. She had built her career on reason, on facts, on being unshakable. And yet, she felt shaken to her core. The way Elijah had looked at her, it wasn't a plea from a desperate child seeking any attachment. It was something deeper, something unmistakable. It was recognition. A photograph that didn't belong. Her mind raced back to the photograph Elijah had been clutching. She had only seen a glimpse of it before it hit the courtroom floor, but something about the way he held onto it, as if his life depended on it, haunted her. Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor as she strode to the door. She had to see that photograph. As she stepped out into the hallway, she spotted Sarah Martinez, the social worker, waiting nearby. The woman's brows were knitted in concern, arms crossed protectively. "Miss Martinez," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Do you have the photograph Elijah was holding?" Sarah hesitated before reaching into the folder tucked under her arm. "Yes, Your Honor. I picked it up after the recess was called. I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to return it to him without your ruling." Rebecca took the worn, creased photograph carefully. Her breath hitched. It was her. A younger version of herself, sitting in a hospital courtyard, one hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. She remembered that day. The last photo taken before everything had gone wrong. Her fingers trembled as she turned the picture over. On the back, a single word was written in a child's shaky handwriting. Mom. Rebecca's vision blurred as realization crashed over her. Elijah wasn't just a foster child. He was her son. The puzzle pieces start to fit. She sank onto a nearby bench, staring at the photograph as though it would suddenly start speaking, explaining everything. How was this possible? The stillbirth, the hurried way the doctors had spoken to her, convincing her not to see the body, not to hold her child. The way they had rushed her into signing the paperwork. She had never questioned it. She had been young, alone, heartbroken. And now, a boy who shouldn't exist had just called her his mother. Rebecca's mind raced. Could there have been a mix-up at the hospital? A falsified record? A stolen baby? She looked up sharply. Miss Martinez, she said, her voice firmer now, controlled. Where exactly did Elijah come from? I mean, before foster care. Sarah sighed. That's the problem, Your Honor. The records from his early life are a mess. Rebecca's heart pounded harder. What do you mean, a mess? Sarah flipped through the file in her hands. He was placed in foster care as an infant, but there's no birth certificate on file. His original paperwork came from a private agency, New Beginnings Family Services. Rebecca's stomach dropped. I've heard of them, she murmured. Sarah nodded grimly. They shut down 5 years ago after a federal investigation into irregularities. It was never made public, but there were rumors about missing records, misplaced adoptions, and falsified birth documents. Rebecca's hands tightened around the photograph. She felt sick. She had spent her entire career fighting for children, and yet her own son had been lost right in front of her. The mother who never stopped searching. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. A bailiff peeked inside. Your Honor, court is set to reconvene in 5 minutes. Rebecca took a deep breath. She wasn't ready. How could she possibly walk back in there and pretend this was just another case? But she had no choice. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a mother. And she was about to fight for the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The courtroom awakens. As she stepped back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. Elijah sat stiffly in his seat, his hands empty now, his gaze flickering up at her with something almost like hope. The Turners were whispering furiously to their lawyer, clearly rattled by the boy's outburst before recess. Rebecca took her seat and cleared her throat. We will now resume proceedings. The murmuring died down. She turned to Elijah. Elijah, do you know who gave you that photograph? He hesitated, then nodded. A lady at the group home. She told me my real mom would find me one day. Rebecca's throat tightened. His real mom. She turned to the Turner's lawyer. Mr. Bradford, I will not be approving the termination of Elijah's placement until we investigate his original adoption records. Patricia Turner gasped. But Your Honor, we... Rebecca silenced her with a sharp look. Your petition is denied. Elijah will not be returning to the group home until I have answers. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Elijah looked at her, his small hands clutching his sleeves, waiting for her to say what he had always known. Rebecca inhaled deeply. She wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. But she knew. And soon, the entire world would too. Unraveling the truth. A mother's instinct. Judge Rebecca Williams had spent her entire career searching for justice, fighting for children who had no voice, ensuring that the law served as a shield for the innocent. But now, sitting behind her bench in courtroom 307, she found herself in a battle she never saw coming. Because this time, she wasn't just the judge. She was the case. The name Elijah Marshall echoed in her head like a distant whisper, a name she had no reason to know, yet something about him had unsettled her the moment she saw him. Now, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, forcing her to confront the possibility that her son, the child she had grieved for 8 years, was not only alive but had been sitting in front of her the entire time. Rebecca inhaled sharply. She had built her life around logic, facts, and evidence. She had trusted the system, trusted the records, trusted the doctors who had told her that her baby had never taken his first breath. But that photograph, that word, Mom, her fingers curled into a fist against the polished wood of her desk. She needed proof, something more than just a gut feeling. She turned her gaze toward Sarah Martinez, the social worker who had been assigned to Elijah's case. The woman had always been thorough, always meticulous. If there was anyone who could help her untangle this mystery, it was her. A paper trail that vanished. "Miss Martinez," Rebecca said, her voice calm despite the storm inside her, "I need every document related to Elijah's entry into the foster care system. Every transfer, every medical report, everything." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Your Honor, I've already looked." Elijah's records air. She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Missing," Rebecca finished for her. Sarah exhaled, nodding. "Yes, there's no birth certificate on file, no hospital records, no original parental information. He was placed into the system as an infant, but his first recorded documentation starts at the age of 1. Before that, it's like he didn't exist." Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears. "And the agency that first placed him, New Beginnings Family Services." Sarah's expression darkened. "They shut down 5 years ago. A federal investigation found evidence of mismanaged adoptions, falsified records, and lost paperwork. But no one was ever charged. Too many files had been destroyed before authorities could act." Rebecca clenched her jaw. If Elijah had been one of those lost children, if someone had stolen him from her and erased his identity, then the system she had dedicated her life to upholding had failed her. A question no one dared ask. Rebecca turned her attention back to Elijah, who sat quietly in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't like most children. He didn't fidget. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. But his eyes never left her. It was as if he was waiting for her to say what he already knew. She cleared her throat. "Elijah, do you remember anything about where you lived before foster care?" The boy hesitated. Then, for the first time since entering the courtroom, he spoke. "I remember a voice," he said softly. "A lady used to sing to me before I went to sleep." Rebecca's breath caught. "What song?" Elijah swallowed. "I don't know the name, but it goes like this." His voice was small, barely above a whisper, but when he hummed the melody, Rebecca's entire world stopped. It was a song only she knew. A lullaby she had sung in the hospital, rubbing her belly, whispering promises to a child she never got to hold. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the desk. No one else could have taught him that song. No one else could have known. A shuddering breath escaped her lips as she stared at the boy in front of her. The boy she was beginning to realize had never been lost, just hidden. The hospital that lied. Judge Williams stood abruptly. "I am postponing the decision on Elijah's placement until further investigation," she announced. The Turners' lawyer, Mr. Bradford, shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, with all due respect." She cut him off with a look so sharp he immediately sat back down. "This child has been in 7 different foster homes," she continued. "Every attempt at placement has failed. And now we have serious discrepancies in his original adoption records." She turned to Sarah Martinez. "Contact the Department of Family Services. I want access to every closed case file from New Beginnings Family Services." Sarah nodded, already scribbling notes. Rebecca wasn't done. She turned back to Mr. Bradford. "And I want a subpoena issued for the hospital where Elijah was supposedly born." The room erupted. Patricia Turner gasped. "What does the hospital have to do with anything?" Rebecca's fingers tightened around the edges of her desk. "Everything. A visit to the past. Hours later, Rebecca found herself standing in front of Street Mercy's Memorial Hospital, the place where her world had fallen apart, where they had told her that her baby never survived, where she had signed the paperwork while drowning in grief, never once questioning what she was being told. Now she questioned everything. As she walked into the lobby, she spotted an elderly nurse at the front desk. Her ID badge read Margaret Lawson. Rebecca approached, her heels clicking against the pristine tile floor. "Excuse me," she said, flashing her credentials. "I need access to a patient file from 8 years ago. My own." The nurse glanced at her paperwork before looking up. Then, something shifted in the woman's face, a flicker of recognition. "Judge Williams." The nurse's voice was quiet. "I remember you." Rebecca's heart stopped. Margaret lowered her voice, glancing around nervously before leaning in. "You were never supposed to see him," she whispered. Rebecca felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "What did you say?" The nurse swallowed hard. "After you gave birth, I saw them take him. They said you never asked to see the body, so it didn't matter." Rebecca's lungs tightened. "What didn't matter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's lips trembled. That he was still breathing. The truth that couldn't be buried. Rebecca took an unsteady step backward. The hospital, the adoption agency, the missing files. Someone had stolen her son. Someone had taken him, erased his identity, and placed him into a system that had failed him over and over again. And now, 8 years later, he had found his way back to her. Her breath hitched as her vision blurred with unshed tears. She turned on her heel and walked straight out of the hospital. She wasn't Judge Williams anymore. She wasn't an impartial legal authority. She was a mother, and she was about to tear apart the system that had stolen her son. A mother's fight for justice. The storm before the truth. Judge Rebecca Williams had spent her life ensuring justice was served. But now, she stood at the center of a case she never expected to fight, one that threatened to tear apart everything she believed in. Because this wasn't just about a child lost in the system. This was about her child. She sat in her dimly lit office, staring at the hospital documents spread across her desk. Medical reports from the day her son had been born. A death certificate she now knew was a lie. And an adoption file so empty it was as if Elijah had been plucked from existence before being dropped into the foster care system a year later. Her breath was shallow as she reached for the phone. She knew who to call. Because if there was one person who never stopped looking for the truth, it was the one woman who had watched Elijah disappear into the system. The only person who had fought for him even when no one else did. The social worker who knew too much. "Sarah, I need you at my office," Rebecca said the moment the social worker picked up. There was a pause before Sarah Martinez answered. "You found something." Rebecca swallowed hard. "I found everything." Less than an hour later, Sarah stepped into Rebecca's chambers, her face pale, her hands gripping a thick folder. "You're not going to believe what I found." Rebecca's fingers twitched as Sarah slammed the file onto the desk. New Beginnings Family Services wasn't just an adoption agency, she said. They were part of a network. Rebecca's blood ran cold. "What kind of network?" she asked. Sarah's voice was almost a whisper. "A black market adoption ring." Rebecca's breath caught. She had suspected it. She had felt the corruption creeping at the edges of this case, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her bones. She flipped open the file. Inside was a list of children placed through New Beginnings. Some had been adopted legally, but others, their origins were marked as unknown. And then she saw it. One name, in faded ink. Elijah Marshall. Next to it, under birth parents, there was nothing. Just an empty space, a void where her name should have been. Her hands clenched. How did they get away with this? Sarah exhaled. Because they had help. She pulled out a signed authorization. Rebecca's stomach dropped. It was from the hospital. The same hospital where she had given birth. Where they had stolen her son and made him disappear. Where they had convinced her he had never lived, her entire body went cold. A case that shook the courtroom. Rebecca knew what she had to do. She wasn't just going to fight for Elijah's custody. She was going to bring down everyone responsible. The next morning, she walked into courtroom 307 with fire in her veins. The Turners were already there, sitting stiffly beside their lawyer. Their eyes darted to the stack of documents in front of her, sensing something had shifted. But they had no idea how much. Rebecca straightened her robe and addressed the room. "We are not here today to discuss Elijah's placement," she said, "because Elijah should have never been in foster care to begin with." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Bradford, the Turner's lawyer, adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what you mean." Rebecca lifted the forged hospital documents for all to see. "This is a fraudulent death certificate," she said, her voice like steel. "One that was used to convince me that my son was dead." Gasps erupted. Patricia Turner's face drained of color. "This is absurd," Mr. Bradford stammered. But Rebecca wasn't done. She held up the adoption records. "These documents prove that Elijah was placed in foster care under falsified records. He was never abandoned. He was stolen." She turned her gaze to the Turners, her voice unwavering. "And you knew?" James Turner shot up from his chair. We didn't know anything. We only took him in as foster parents." "You took in a child who had no verifiable birth certificate," Rebecca interrupted. "A child whose past had been wiped clean, yet you never questioned why." Silence. Guilt flashed across their faces. They hadn't asked questions because they didn't want to know the answers. Rebecca turned to Sarah. "Miss Martinez, based on these findings, is there any legal ground for the state to remove Elijah from the foster system?" Sarah's voice was firm. "Yes. Elijah's placement was based on fraudulent records. Legally, he should be returned to his biological parent." Rebecca exhaled slowly. "The court finds that Elijah Marshall was wrongfully placed in foster care. Effective immediately, his placement is terminated." She turned toward Elijah. For the first time, he smiled. It was small, hesitant, but it was real. And then, in front of the entire courtroom, he ran to her. Rebecca caught him, her arms wrapping tightly around him as he buried his face in her shoulder. Her son. After 8 years. After a lifetime of grief and loss. She had him back. Justice and the future. The fallout was immediate. The hospital executives who had signed off on the fraudulent death certificate were arrested. The adoption agency's former directors were placed under federal investigation. And Elijah? He was finally home. Days after the trial, Rebecca sat in her living room, watching Elijah sketch at the coffee table. His drawings were getting brighter. Less gray, more color. She reached over, brushing a curl from his forehead. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, setting his pencil down. Then he looked at her and said the words she had been waiting to hear. "I love you, Mom." Tears blurred Rebecca's vision. She had spent her life bringing justice to others. Now justice had finally found her. And she wasn't letting go. Not ever again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.